trying to say something.
Yes. You know, there's a kind of bird that don't have legs, so it can't light on nothing, but it has to stay all its life on its wings in the sky. Like that bird I described in Office Descending, I suppose I have a restlessness that carries me from place to place. Occasionally I come to rest at the southernmost point of America, Key West, to write. My studio was built around the middle of the 1950s. It was the first thing I built there. I do travel a great deal, but it doesn't stop me from working. Some days I write 6 hours or an hour and a half, depending on how well I slept. I do a lot of reading here, too. I think the most moving writer to me that ever lived was Chekhov, personally. He's almost been a fetish with me, Chekhov. I read everything about him I can find. I love his letters, his journals, and, of course, his theater. I spent a whole summer, the summer of 1934, reading Chekhov's short stories at my grandparents' home in Memphis. Yeah.
Do you think that your locale, the South, is similar to Chekhov?
Very much, very much. Like Tsarist Russia, yeah.
But it changed. Is the South changing in the same way?
Oh, I think the South cannot resist change, although it would very much like to believe it's still and gone with the wind. My religion? Well, I've never defined it precisely to myself. And it'd be still more difficult to define it people. Except that I know that I've said this often, in times of great distress, I pray. I don't think of God as somebody listening to individual appeals, but I think the act of praying is solace.
The priest in the Night of the Iguana, do you relate to his feeling about God as he describes it?
Oh, yes, very much, yeah. You mean that he connected him with the elements? Yeah, with the naked elements, yeah. I think back of existence, there has to be a creative force. Otherwise, there could be no existence. Something has to have created existence. And just as, like, you know, the plainest kind of geometry, you know, that constantly there is a creative force, so we couldn't exist. Nothing could exist. And so you may call him God. Why not? It's a good word, short one. In Night of the Iguana, the priest Shannon is black Irish. His nervous state is terribly apparent. He's a young man who has cracked up before. He's going to crack again, perhaps repeatedly. Private lives of people here are infinitely wilder than they would appear to be on the surface, you know, in the open.
Is that indeed why there is wildness in the characters of the plays you've written about the South?
Yes, I like to show the surface of their lives and then to show what's back of the surface, you know, it makes an interesting contrast.
Maybe that's why people everywhere can relate to your characters, no matter where they come from.
I hope they can. I've never understood it, because I think of myself as being a very, very peculiar and eccentric person. And I don't see how the majority of people could relate at all to the people I create.
Maybe it's the eccentric in each individual that they see.
You think other people are as eccentric as me?
In a more hidden way.
Well, that's a relief to hear that. It's very encouraging. I shall continue with my eccentricity now. Character of Quentin in Small Craft Warning is very real. I think he has some of my most poetic lines. He was, in a way, the most complex character I've drawn. And I think his long speech is the best thing I've written probably in the last 10 years. Best piece of writing. I thought as a piece of writing it justified the play in a way. He had been through a unique crisis of self-realization, which he felt, to the point where he said it was almost like epileptic seizure, the astonishment of being himself alive, present in the flesh, being. And I had felt that myself, but never been able to express it before in any work. And I did get it through Quentin. The fact of his sexual deviation seemed relatively unimportant to me. The important part, Quentin, was his capacity for astonishment in the fact of existence and his loss of that capacity. That was the important part of the speech, I thought. Men pity and love each other more deeply than they permit themselves to know. And sometimes I like to express my own capacity for surprise and paint and poetry. Although I wrote a poet's vocation, it's something that rests on something as thin and fine as the web of a spider. Occasionally a poem is merely time for humor. It's called Life Story. After you've been to bed together for the first time without the disadvantage of any prior acquaintance, the other party very often says to you, "Tell me about yourself. I want to know all about you. What's your story?" And you think maybe they really and truly do sincerely want to know your life story. And so you light up a cigarette and begin to tell it to them. And the two of you lying together in completely relaxed positions like a pair of rag dolls, a bored child dropped on a bed. You tell them your story, or as much of your story as time or a fair degree of prudence allows, and they say, "Oh, oh, 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 oh," each time a little more faintly, until the "oh" is just an audible breath. And then, of course, there's some interruption. Slow room service comes up with a bowl of melting ice cubes. Or one of you rises to pee and gazes at himself with mild astonishment in the bathroom mirror. And then the first thing you know, before you've had time to pick up where you left off with your enthralling life story, they're telling you their life story exactly as they'd intended to all along, and you're saying, "Oh, oh, oh, oh." Each time a little more faintly, the vowel at last becoming no more than an audible sigh, as the elevator halfway down the corridor and a turn to the left draws one last long and deep breath of exhaustion and stops breathing forever. Then, well, one of you falls and the other one does likewise with a lighted cigarette in his mouth. And that's how people burn to death in hotel rooms.
People have written about you say that you come from the sad soil of America.
You don't know what they're talking about. I don't find it sad. I'm sure there is misery in the South, as there is everywhere. But for me, it never represents sadness. Romanticism, yes. Romantic melancholy, yes. But although I suffer a great deal of privation, I used to have to go out and bum a cigarette, start work in the morning. Still, I was not sad about it. I think I've done some of my best early work in New Orleans. I wrote most of Streetcar Named Desire here in New Orleans. This house is like the one in the play. Elysian Fields is a real street, you see. It's actually not it's on the border of the French Quarter. And Desire is also a real street. I was attracted to the name,
How would you describe Blanche in Streetcar?
Not a great intellect, but she had a great sensibility, I believe. I'm not sure she would even exist today.
Why?
Because the South has changed so very much. Well, maybe she would. Now, it's hard to say. There are still some Southern ladies with all kinds of romantic pretensions. But underneath Blanche's pretensions was something genuinely sensitive and tender. And so many of the Southern ladies that I meet nowadays with these garden district airs about them and the plantation niceties of behavior, you find them hard as nails underneath.
Didn't you say, though, that Blanche also was a tigress underneath?
Yes, she was. She was a strong, weak person.
But why did she have to go mad?
Because odds were so very heavily weighed against her, and she had to expiate the death of her husband. I think that Blanche and Stanley Kowalski are the two sides of every human nature. Stanley and Blanche were on a collision course, and one of them had to break, and the one that broke was Blanche. I feel that I am both Stanley and Blanche. A plague has stricken the moths. The moths are dying. Their bodies are flakes of bronze on the carpets lying. Enemies of the delicate everywhere have breathed a pestilent mist into the air. Lament for the velvety moths, for the moths were lovely. Often their tender thoughts, for they thought of me, eased the neurotic ills that haunt the day. Now an invisible evil takes them away. I move through the shadowy rooms. I cannot be still. I must find where the treacherous killer is concealed. Feverishly I search, and still they fall, fragile as ashes broken against a wall. Now that the plague has taken the moths away, who will be cooler than curtains against the day? Who will come early and softly to ease my lot as I move through the shadowy rooms with a troubled heart? Give them, O mother of moths and mother of men, strength to enter the heavy world again. For delicate were the moths and badly wanted here in a world by mammoth figures haunted.
In a way, Blanche was a moth.
A very strong moth, sort of a tiger moth. My childhood was spent in the South, and childhood is always a magic part of life. All those little towns in Mississippi that I lived in with my grandparents, like Canton and Columbus, were happy. They made a happy background of my sisters and my childhood. When we lived in Nashville, I remember playing in the park. I remember picking wild flowers in the park. I remember going to kindergarten, a sort of experimental model kindergarten in Nashville. I was very delighted with the alphabet blocks, the colored crayons and everything until Mother slipped out of the room and left me. When I discovered she was gone, I started to howl and stomp on the floor. I made such a racket that she heard me all the way down the block, and she had to come back and get me. And that was the end of my kindergarten career. Sister and I were unusually close as children. I think mainly because at the age of 7, I had this very, very, very bad case of diphtheria, which made me virtually an invalid. I think my mother made me feel more of an invalid than I actually was. She put such emphasis on my weakness. She even claimed that I couldn't walk. She talked me out of walking, I think, for about half a year. So I was naturally thrown mostly with my sister as a companion, you see. And so my sister and I grew so used to being company for each other that we tended to rely upon each other's companionship rather than seeking friends, outside the household.
As a child, was Rose a very outgoing, lively person?
Much more. There was no trace of her later schizophrenia. She was very imaginative and lively.
In the Glass Menagerie, was Laura patterned after your sister Rose?
I think all of my characters are more or less created. I don't know. There was The fragility, the vulnerability, those qualities, yes. The delicacy, yeah, certainly those qualities. But I think characters undergo great transmutation in the process of writing. I mean, even if they start from an original person, a true person, I mean. Yes, I have tricks in my pockets. I have things up my sleeve. But I am the opposite of a stage magician. It gives you illusion that has the appearance of truth. I give you truth in the pleasant disguise of illusion. To begin with, I turn back time. I reverse it to that quaint period, the 30s, when the huge middle class of America was matriculating in a school for the blind. Their eyes had failed them, or they had failed their eyes, and so they were having their fingers pressed forcibly down upon the fiery braille alphabet of a dissolving economy. In Spain, there was revolution. Here there was only shouting and confusion. In Spain, there was Guernica. Here there were disturbances of labor, sometimes pretty violent, and otherwise peaceful cities such as Chicago, Cleveland, St. Louis. This is the social background of the play. The play is memory. Being a memory play, it is dimly lighted. It is sentimental. It is not realistic. In memory, everything seems to happen to music. That explains the fiddle in the wings. I am the narrator of the play, and also a character in it. The other characters are my mother, Amanda, my sister, Laura, and a gentleman caller. He is the long-delayed, but always expected something that we live for. There's a fifth character in the play who doesn't appear, except in this larger-than-life-size photograph over the mantel. This is our father, who left us a long time ago. He was a telephone man who fell in love with long distance. He gave up his job with the telephone company, and he skipped the light fantastic out of town. The last we heard of him was a picture postcard from Mazatlan on the Pacific coast of Mexico, containing a message of 2 words: hello, goodbye, and no address. I descended the steps of this fire escape for a last time, and followed from then on in my father's footsteps, attempting to find in motion what was lost in space. I traveled around a good deal. The city swept around me like dead leaves, leaves that were brightly colored but torn away from the branches. I would have stopped, but I was pursued by something. It always came upon me unawares, taking me altogether by surprise. Perhaps it was a familiar bit of music. Perhaps it was only a transparent bit of glass. Perhaps I'm walking along a street at night in some strange city before I found companions. I passed the lighted window of a shop where perfume is sold. The window is filled with pieces of colored glass, tiny, transparent bottles in delicate colors, like bits of a shattered rainbow. Then all at once, my sister touches my shoulder. Oh, Laura, Laura, I tried to leave you behind me, but I have been more faithful than I intended to be. For nowadays, the world is lit by lightning. Blow out your candles, Laura. And so goodbye.
Cry. Your next long play is a story of yourself recently.
This, yes, it's the story of the decade of the 60s, especially the last 6 or 7 years of the 60s, when I was going through a terrible period of disorientation. The play is about disorientation. I believe the more popular word is alienation, although I don't quite know what alienation means. These people are really lost, as I was.
Who are the people in Outcry?
I think they are two sides of one person. In the beginning, the brother is setting the stage for a performance which they are to give in some very far away primitive. They've crossed many frontiers. Such remarks to him at one point. I didn't know there were so many frontiers in the world. Well, they've arrived at this final theater, and the play opens with his monologue, which goes as follows. To play with fear is to play with fire, no worse. Much worse than playing with fire. Fire has limits. It comes to a river or sea, and there it stops. It comes to stone or bare earth that it can't leap across, and there is don't know the next step. The person so loved and needed would hold you in contempt of human law and resisting arrest. Not quite that, but something like that. Work that over. Or maybe put it this way. In the heart of the person to whom you cried out, there is a little automatic sound apparatus. Yes. And it whispers to this person, demand, blackmail, despicable, rejected. Yes, and then the next morning, you have to make your own coffee, your own phone calls, and go alone to the doctor to say, I'm afraid I'm dying. That should be a bravo now.
And when you smile for all the little girls in the audience, you can open your mouth. You got some teeth missing too, don't you?
Can I remind you of one thing that's
I'd be equally as willing for a dentist to be drilling than to ever let a woman in my life.